The avoidant rejected you expecting specific, predictable response based on patterns they observed throughout relationship, expecting you to protest the rejection, to express hurt and anger about being rejected, to attempt to change their mind through demonstrating your value or through communicating what you could do differently, to pursue them despite rejection in ways that would allow them to maintain connection. While avoiding commitment, the rejection was designed to escape. They expected your emotional response to their rejection would provide them material to work with. Your hurt would confirm their power to affect you. Your anger would validate their decision by positioning you as too emotional or unstable. Your attempts to change their mind would affirm their worth by demonstrating you valued them enough to fight for relationship. Your continued pursuit despite rejection would allow them to maintain your availability without providing committed reciprocation. The expected response would serve multiple functions for the avoidant's defended psychology, would confirm their importance and their value, would provide external focus on your reaction that prevents internal examination of their patterns, would generate narrative about rejection that protects their ego and their defended worldview, would maintain their control over relationship outcome and over you. Yet you responded with complete silence that violated every element of their expectations. You did not protest rejection or attempt to change their mind. You did not express hurt or anger that they could respond to or manage. You did not pursue them despite rejection or maintain availability hoping they would reconsider. You simply disappeared, stopped all contact, stopped all communication, stopped monitoring their life, stopped existing in their awareness in any active, engaged way. Your silence was not strategic, temporary withdrawal designed to make them miss you. It was genuine release reflecting your acceptance of their rejection as final, your decision to protect yourself through complete disengagement, your choice to redirect energy toward your healing and your forward movement, rather than remaining oriented toward them and toward hoping they would change their mind about rejection. The silence destroyed them in ways your expected emotional response never would have destroyed them, because silence eliminated all the defensive functions your emotional engagement would have served. Without your hurt to respond to, they face their own feelings about rejection without external distraction. Without your anger to defend against, they sit with their choice without ability to position themselves as victim of your excessive reaction. Without your pursuit to validate worth, they face that rejection did not generate the fight for them they expected. Without your continued availability, they confront permanent loss they did not anticipate rejection would create. Without your emotional processing happening where they can observe and respond to it, they face internal void where your familiar presence and your familiar reactions used to exist. The destruction manifests through the avoidance psychological crisis, where all their defended assumptions about themselves and about their importance to you collapse under weight of your indifferent silence. They assumed they were important enough to you that rejection would devastate you. Your silence suggests rejection affected you minimally, or that you recovered quickly enough that devastation was temporary rather than permanent. They assumed you valued them enough that you would fight to change their mind. Your silence demonstrates you accepted rejection without protest, suggesting perhaps their value was insufficient to warrant fighting for. They assumed rejection gave them power position. Your silence eliminated their power by making rejection mutual through your complete disengagement that communicates you also choose not to be in relationship with them. They assumed rejection was reversible if they changed their mind. Your silence creates permanent separation that their potential reconsideration cannot unilaterally reverse, because reversal requires your cooperation you are not providing. The destruction particularly stems from the avoidance recognition that your silence proves you are genuinely okay, or even better without them. That rejection freed you rather than devastating you. That you are moving forward while they remain stuck, processing rejection they initiated. They observe or learn through mutual connections that you are building satisfying life, that you appear genuinely happy rather than performing happiness, that you are not spending your energy pining for them or hoping for reconciliation. This observation forces devastating recognition. Their rejection did not destroy you as they assumed it would. Their importance to you was less than they believed. Their value was insufficient to create lasting impact. You are thriving in their absence in ways that suggest relationship with them was limitation rather than enhancement of your well-being. Your silence eliminated their power to control the narrative of why you're not together. The avoidant expected rejection to generate your emotional response that they could incorporate into narrative about why relationship ended, narrative they would construct and communicate to themselves, to you, to mutual friends, to future partners, explaining relationship failure in ways that protect their ego and their defended worldview. Your expected hurt would allow narrative where you were too emotionally reactive or too sensitive. Your expected anger would support narrative where you were unstable or vindictive person they needed to protect themselves from. Your expected attempts to change their mind would enable narrative where you were too needy or too clingy. Your expected pursuit despite rejection would facilitate narrative where you could not accept their reasonable boundaries or their need for space. Each of these expected responses would provide them material to construct story about rejection that positions them favorably while positioning you as problem. Story where they made reasonable or necessary decision while you responded problematically in ways that validated their choice. Yet your silence eliminated all material for such narratives by providing no response they can characterize as problematic or excessive. You did not react emotionally in ways they can point to as evidence of instability. You did not pursue in ways they can characterize as neediness. You did not protest in ways they can frame as inability to respect boundaries. You simply accepted rejection silently and disappeared, providing them nothing to work with for constructing narrative that positions you as problem and them as person who made reasonable choice. The silence forces them to construct narrative based solely on their rejection without being able to incorporate your reaction as justification. They rejected you and you accepted rejection with dignity and disappeared, leaving them with no material to deflect responsibility or to characterize your behavior as validating their choice. The eliminated power to control narrative creates specific psychological crisis where the avoidant faces that rejection reflects on them rather than reflecting on you. When you respond emotionally or continue pursuing after rejection, they can make rejection about your response. I rejected them and they became too emotional, proving I made right choice, or I rejected them and they kept pursuing me, showing they were too clingy. These narratives make rejection about your inadequacy or your problematic behavior rather than about their patterns or their choice. Your silence eliminates this deflection. I rejected them and they disappeared completely, does not create narrative about your inadequacy, but instead creates questions about why they rejected someone who had enough self-respect to accept rejection definitively and enough strength to move forward without protest or pursuit. The narrative void particularly troubles the avoidant when they must explain relationship ending to others. Mutual friends ask what happened, and the avoidant faces that they cannot construct compelling story that positions them favorably without being able to incorporate your response. They rejected you because, what? They needed space, and you accepted that space completely. They were not ready for relationship, and you accepted that without protest. They decided relationship was not right fit, and you agreed by disappearing without fight. Each explanation reveals they rejected someone who responded with dignity and strength, rather than with problematic behavior that validates rejection. The lack of your problematic response makes their rejection appear more questionable. Why reject someone who responds to rejection with such clear self-respect and such definitive acceptance? Your silence also prevents the avoidant from constructing narrative where rejection was mutual, or where you bear equal responsibility for relationship ending. They want to frame ending as, we both decided relationship was not working, or we had incompatibilities neither of us could overcome, or we mutually agreed to go our separate ways. Narratives that suggest shared responsibility and shared decision-making. Yet your silence after their rejection makes clear the rejection was their unilateral choice rather than mutual decision, was their pattern-driven decision rather than response to incompatibilities you both recognized, was ending they chose while you were willing to continue working on relationship. Your silence after their rejection, combined with your previous efforts to maintain relationship, makes narrative of mutual ending impossible. They rejected someone who was fighting for relationship, making ending clearly their choice rather than shared choice they can hide behind. The eliminated narrative control also manifests in the avoidant's inability to construct story where rejection was temporary or reversible. When you pursue after rejection or maintain availability, hoping they will reconsider, they can frame rejection as taking break or needing space to figure things out. or stepping back temporarily. Framings that suggest rejection was pause rather than ending, that leave door open for potential reconciliation, they control timing of, that maintain their power to determine whether relationship resumes. Your silence and your complete disengagement make these framings impossible. Rejection was clearly ending rather than pause because you treated it as ending through your definitive departure. Door is clearly closed rather than open because you closed it through your silence and you're moving forward. Timing of any potential reconciliation is clearly not in their control because reconciliation requires your cooperation you are not offering. The narrative destruction particularly wounds when the avoidant realizes they cannot position themselves as victim in story about relationship ending. Throughout relationship, they may have framed themselves as victim of your needs, your expectations, your emotional demands, framing that positioned them as persons struggling under burden of your requirements. Rejection should have been culmination of this victim narrative. They finally freed themselves from relationship that was too demanding. They finally established boundary, protecting themselves from expectations they could not meet. Yet your silence after rejection destroys victim narrative by proving you were not burden they needed to escape. If you were such burden, why does your absence create such destruction for them? Why do they struggle so much after freeing themselves from supposed burden? Why does silence prove they were not victim of your demands, but were actually person whose patterns drove away partner, who accommodated those patterns extensively before finally accepting rejection and leaving? Understanding that your silence eliminated their power to control narrative allows you to recognize why silence destroys them more effectively than emotional response would have destroyed them. Emotional response would have provided material for narrative that protects their ego, narrative where your reaction validated their choice, where you proved through your response that rejection was correct decision, where they emerge as person who made reasonable choice while you demonstrated problematic behavior. Your silence eliminated all such protective narratives by forcing them to face rejection was their choice that reflects on them. That your dignified acceptance makes their rejection appear questionable rather than validated, that they cannot position themselves as victim or hero but instead must face. They rejected someone who responded with strength and self-respect that makes their rejection look worse rather than better. The narrative void created by your silence leaves them sitting with uncomfortable reality that rejection was their pattern-driven choice, that cost them relationship with someone who had enough self-worth to accept rejection definitively, rather than pursuing someone who demonstrated through rejection they could not meet legitimate relationship requirements. The silence forced them to sit with their choice without your emotional response to distract them. The avoidant expected your emotional response to their rejection would provide external focus that prevents internal examination of their choice and their patterns. Your expected hurt would give them your pain to manage, to respond to feel guilty about in ways that keep them focused on you rather than on themselves. Your expected anger would give them your accusations to defend against, to explain themselves in response to justify their choice against in ways that keep attention on your reaction rather than on their patterns. Your expected pursuit would give them your attempts to change their mind, to consider, to respond to manage in ways that keep them engaged with you rather than engaged with internal examination of why they made rejection choice. The expected emotional content from you would fill psychological space with external processing your feelings, managing your reactions, responding to your behaviors. That prevents internal processing about their choice, their patterns, their responsibility. Yet your silence eliminated all external distraction by providing nothing for them to respond to, nothing for them to manage, nothing to focus their attention on outside themselves. Without your hurt to manage, they face their own feelings about rejection without external distraction of comforting you or defending their choice against your pain. Without your anger to defend against, they sit with their decision without ability to externalize examination through explaining themselves to you. Without your pursuit to respond to, they confront their choice without being able to focus on managing your attempts to restore relationship. The silence creates psychological void where your emotional content used to exist, void that forces internal focus rather than external focus, that requires them to sit with their own experience of rejection rather than managing your experience of being rejected. The forced internal sitting manifests through the avoidant facing their own feelings about loss without ability to project those feelings onto you or to manage those feelings through managing yours. They feel grief about losing you, yet, without your visible grief to respond to, they must sit with their own grief rather than focusing on yours. They feel regret about rejection, yet without your pain to feel guilty about, they must examine their regret and what it reflects about their choice, rather than focusing guilt on having hurt you. They feel confusion about whether rejection was correct choice, yet without your arguments for why relationships should continue to respond to, they must examine their confusion internally rather than processing it through defending against your arguments. They feel fear about permanent loss, yet without your pursuit suggesting possibility of reconciliation to manage, they must sit with fear rather than being distracted by managing your efforts to restore connection. The silence particularly forces the avoidant to face questions they could avoid if your emotional response provided distraction. Why did they reject you? What exactly was inadequate about relationship that necessitated rejection? Their patterns prevented intimacy. Why do they maintain patterns that prevent what they claim to want? They felt engulfed or overwhelmed? Why does normal relationship closeness feel threatening to them? They needed space. Why do they need so much space that relationship becomes unsustainable? They were not ready. Why are they never ready, despite time and despite partner, who accommodated their defended limitations extensively? These questions would be easier to avoid if your emotional response kept them focused externally. But silence forces internal examination of questions that reveal their defended structure as problem rather than relationship, or you being problem. Your silence also forces them to sit with contrast between their expectations about how rejection would feel and actual experience of rejection aftermath. They expected rejection would feel liberating, would eliminate pressure they felt from your needs and your expectations, would restore defended autonomy they felt relationship threatened, would relieve them of obligations relationship created. They expected to feel relief and renewed freedom after rejection allowed them to escape relationship discomfort. Yet actual experience contradicts expectations. Rejection feels more like loss than liberation, creates pain rather than relief, generates destruction rather than restored comfortable defended position they anticipated. Your silence prevents them from blaming this contradiction on you. If you were pursuing or expressing pain, they could attribute their post-rejection suffering to guilt about hurting you or to stress of managing your reaction. Your silence eliminates this external explanation, forcing them to face their suffering stems from their choice and from recognizing they rejected something valuable they now miss, rather than stemming from your reaction to rejection. The forced sitting without distraction also confronts the avoidant with their pattern of creating then regretting loss. This is likely not first time they rejected or pushed away someone then regretted it. Pattern probably exists across multiple relationships where their defended patterns created distance that eventually became permanent loss they felt ambivalent about or regretful about. Your emotional response to rejection would allow them to focus on managing current situation rather than examining pattern, would keep attention on your reaction rather than on their repetitive cycle. Your silence creates space for pattern recognition. They have done this before. They are doing this again. They will likely do this in future unless pattern gets examined and addressed. The pattern recognition forced by silence is uncomfortable examination they prefer avoiding, yet silence eliminates distraction that would allow continued avoidance. The silence-forced internal sitting particularly reveals to the avoidant that their rejected, comfortable, defended position may not actually be comfortable. Throughout relationship, they felt pressured by intimacy, felt threatened by your needs, felt uncomfortable with vulnerability relationship required. They believed rejection would restore comfortable, defended independence, free from relationship discomfort. Yet silence allows them to experience defended independence without your presence, and to recognize defended independence is lonely, isolating, unsatisfying in ways relationship with you buffered them from experiencing. Your presence provided connection that made their defended position more tolerable. They could be defended while still having you nearby, providing benefits of partnership. Your silence-created absence forces them to experience full cost of defended position. They have defended autonomy, but they have no one to share life with. They have emotional control, but they have no intimacy. They have independence, but they have profound loneliness. The recognition that defended position they protected through rejection is not actually satisfying or comfortable is revelation your silence forces. By eliminating distractions, your emotional response would have provided. Understanding that silence forced them to sit with their choice without distraction allows you to recognize why silence destroys them more than emotional response would. Emotional response would have kept them focused externally, focused on managing you, on defending against you, on responding to you, in ways that prevent internal examination of their choice and their patterns. Silence eliminated external focus, forcing internal reckoning with their decision, with their feelings about loss, with questions about their patterns, with contrast between expected liberation and actual suffering, with recognition of their repetitive pattern, with reality that defended position they protected through rejection is not actually comfortable existence they anticipated. The destruction comes from facing themselves without distraction. Facing that rejection was their pattern-driven choice that they now regret, that they rejected something valuable rather than escaping something burdensome, that their defended patterns cost them rather than protect them. Your silence gave them gift of internal examination they need, even though examination is painful. Emotional response would have been distraction that protects them from examination, while silence forces examination that creates their destruction, but also creates their only opportunity for genuine recognition of how their defended patterns harm themselves and cost them relationships with people who matter. They expected your pursuit to validate their worth. Your indifference shattered their ego. The avoidance ego and sense of worth became dependent on your consistent pursuit throughout relationship, and they expected rejection would generate continued pursuit that would validate their worth despite rejection. Each time they withdrew and you pursued, each time they demonstrated inadequacy and you continued investing, each time they created distance and you worked to close that distance, they received confirmation of their value, you cared enough to chase them, valued them enough to tolerate their patterns, wanted them enough to continue pursuing despite their defended behavior that pushed you away. This consistent pursuit despite their patterns allowed them to maintain sense that they are a highly valuable person whose worth justifies your continued effort, whose patterns are acceptable or even attractive given that you keep investing despite those patterns, whose presence in your life holds sufficient importance that you will work to maintain connection they refuse to maintain. The rejection was supposed to be ultimate test of their worth through your response to rejection. If you pursued after rejection, if you fought to change their mind, if you expressed how much you wanted them despite their rejection, this response would provide ultimate validation. They are so valuable that even their rejection does not end your pursuit. So important that you will not accept rejection. So worthy that you will fight for them despite their choice to end relationship. The expected pursuit after rejection would confirm their inflated sense of worth by demonstrating you cannot let them go even when they explicitly reject you, that their value transcends even their own choice to end relationship, because you value them too highly to accept their rejection as final. Yet your silence and your indifference shattered this entire ego structure by communicating opposite message from validation they expected. You did not pursue after rejection suggesting you accepted rejection easily rather than finding it devastating. You did not fight to change their mind suggesting relationship with them was not valuable enough to warrant fighting for. You did not express how much you wanted them suggesting you did not want them as intensely as they believed you wanted them. You demonstrated complete indifference to rejection, suggesting rejection freed you rather than devastating you, suggesting they were not as important or valuable to you as their ego required believing. Your indifferent silence communicated brutal assessment. They are not worth pursuing after rejection, not valuable enough to fight for, not important enough to prevent your acceptance of rejection and your moving forward. The shattered ego manifests through the avoidance recognition that perhaps they are not as special or valuable as your previous pursuit led them to believe. Your previous pursuit confirmed inflated self-perception, where they viewed themselves as person of exceptional worth, whose patterns should be tolerated because access to them justified tolerance, whose defended limitations should be accommodated because their value exceeded cost of accommodation, whose inconsistent presence should be accepted because moments with them were valuable enough to justify accepting inconsistency. Your indifference after rejection destroys this inflated self-perception by demonstrating you assessed relationship and determined they were not valuable enough to pursue after rejection, not special enough to fight for despite their choice, not important enough to prevent your easy acceptance and your moving forward. Your indifference particularly devastates their ego because it came after an extended period where you did pursue, did accommodate, did tolerate their patterns. The contrast between previous pursuit and current indifference reveals your previous investment had limits they exceeded through rejection. They cannot dismiss your indifference as indicating you never valued them or never invested adequately. Evidence of your extensive previous pursuit and accommodation contradicts such dismissal. Your indifference specifically after rejection demonstrates you valued them, while they demonstrated adequate reciprocation, but you do not value them enough to pursue when they explicitly reject you. This conditional nature of your valuation wounds ego that depended on believing your valuation of them was unconditional and unlimited, regardless of how they behaved. The ego shattering also stems from your indifference, proving their rejected position is not enviable position that generates pursuit, but is instead position that generates abandonment. Their defended psychology operates from assumption that their independence is attractive, that their emotional control makes them desirable, that their defended unavailability creates mystery and scarcity that increases their value. Rejection should have been demonstration of ultimate attractive independence. They were so independent and autonomous that they could reject relationship, so emotionally controlled that rejection did not devastate them, so unavailable that they chose defended solitude over partnership with you. Your expected pursuit would confirm this position is attractive by showing you could not let them go despite their rejection. Yet your indifference proves their defended position is not attractive, but is instead limitation that cost them. You did not pursue their rejected defended independence, but instead you left them to their defended solitude. They chose through rejection, demonstrating their defended position is not enviable state. Others pursue but is isolated state. Others abandon when given opportunity. Your indifference after rejection also eliminates the ego protection that your visible suffering would have provided. If you demonstrated devastation about rejection, your suffering would validate their importance. They matter so much to you that rejection destroys you. Their presence in your life was so significant that absence creates visible, profound suffering. Your devastation would protect their ego by confirming they have power to deeply affect you. Their choice creates major impact on your life. They are person whose rejection devastates rather than person whose rejection is accepted easily. Your indifference eliminates this ego protection by suggesting rejection affected you minimally. You accepted rejection and moved forward without visible suffering, suggesting they were not important enough to create lasting impact. Their absence does not devastate you, suggesting their presence was not as significant as their ego needed believing.